Center, Professor Geoffrey Stone.
Delighted to be here.
You regaled a crowd at Chautauqua on your book Perilous Times, and which was sort of running a chronology of events, freedom of speech during times of war, which was a very good, I really enjoyed the chronology. And as part of that, of course, in preparation for you coming here, we learned a little bit about you, Geoffrey Stone. Not only your career at Chicago, but before that, if you had to highlight your life and say, all right, here are the Letterman highlights of Geoffrey Stone's career, what would you say? How would you go say, Greg, hadn't thought about this, but here are some points that I find as I would want people to reflect on me.
Well, I don't know if I'd want people to reflect on me, but I think I can identify sort of turning points, moments which clearly caused me to move in particular directions. First was the decision to attend the University of Chicago Law School as a student. This was 1968. I was graduating college. The draft was ongoing. At that time, the government gave you 1 year graduate deferment. So I fully expected at the end of 1968-69 to either be drafted or to leave the country. When I was a college student, what I was really interested in doing was archaeology. And I had talked to some of my professors about whether it made sense to start a PhD program in archaeology. And they said no, it didn't make any sense to do 1 year if I was going to, at that point, either have to leave the country or go into the Army. That 1 year of archaeology made no sense, so I wasn't sure what to do with my year. And since several of my friends were going to law school, I decided that I might as well try law school, since everyone said that 1 year of law school, if nothing else, would stand you in good stead no matter what you did later. And Chicago, I chose really because my girlfriend at the time was transferring to Northwestern, and I wanted to be in the same city as she was. And she then broke up with me the night before I left to go to Chicago. So coming to Chicago, which at the moment I got there seemed like a tragedy, it turned out to be a wonderful turning point for me, because without that I doubt I would be sitting here today talking to you. And the education I got there was extraordinary, and it clearly set me off in certain directions. The second, I suppose, would be getting a clerkship with Justice Brennan. Not only because it was a credentialing event that was of obvious consequence, but also it was a great experience, an opportunity to see the inside of the Supreme Court and the way the government operated. But also, Brennan and my professor at Chicago and later colleague, Harry Calvin, were the two people who really excited me about the First Amendment. And so I would say a second critical point in my shaping my career was the experience with Calvin and Brennan, and learning from them about the importance of the First Amendment and the difficulty of thinking clearly about it. And that clearly played a major role in what I've spent much of the rest of my career doing. And the third, I think, was deciding largely by accident to enter a teaching career, which was not what I had intended to do, but which came about, again, largely by a strange set of coincidences. And I didn't expect to spend my career as a law professor, but fell in love with it once I became exposed to it. So I suppose those are the three things that were most important in sort of setting me off in the direction that I wound up going in. The somewhat serendipitous decision to go to law school, the opportunity to work with people like Harry Calvin and William Brennan, and then the kind of accidental decision to try teaching.
William Brennan, you were there during the 1972 term?
Correct.
Which was the Roe v. Wade term?
Mm-hmm.
A case of huge significance. Can you give a little background of what was the buzz when the case was accepted for argument, and kind of what was going on behind the scenes?
Well, it was actually accepted for argument the year before, and the court had heard argument in the 71-72 term and didn't resolve the case. Blackmun had not completed writing an opinion, and so, as is the practice in the Supreme Court, when a case is not resolved at the end of a term, it has to be re-argued from scratch. And so in the 72 term, it started all over again. And, but there was a whole history that went on before I actually got on the scene, of which I know only secondhand. But by the time the case was argued in the 72 term, all of the justices were pretty clear on how they were going to vote in the case, with the exception of Berger, who continued to vacillate. But since there were 6 votes in favor, that was not relevant to the disposition of the case. Berger had actually initially voted with the majority in the 71 term, and he was the one who had assigned the opinion to Blackmun. But by the time the 72 term began, he was again somewhat uncertain about how he would come out. The main issue during the course of the 72 term was how Blackmun would actually structure the opinion. And the issue that I recall was especially troublesome was how to define the period at which the government would have sufficient interest in regulating abortion so that the initial right could be overcome by the state's interest in protecting either the life of the fetus or the health of the mother. And Brennan and Blackmun were the two who really, during the 72 term, worked out the trimester system, which hadn't been there before that. And the key to that was the notion of viability. I believe it was Brennan who first came up with the idea, although it seems obvious after it's stated, that the government's interest in protecting the life of the fetus becomes great enough to prohibit abortion except to save the life or health of the mother once the fetus is viable. Once the alternative exists of removing it from the body and it could survive on its own, at least without the mother, then the mother's privacy interest in terminating the pregnancy is no longer sufficient to justify aborting the pregnancy. And that was a difficult position for the court to come to, but it was one of those moments, I think, when in a conversation between Brennan and Blackmun, they sort of hit upon it as a sensible way of helping to draw lines coherently. Berger finally came around to join the majority opinion, but there was a bit of a drama when it came time to announce the decision. After a year and a half of deliberation and opinion writing, everything was finally done by January of 73, and the court was ready to announce the decision on that Monday, which was the day before Nixon's inauguration. And Chief Justice Berger, on that Friday, announced that he wanted to write a concurring opinion. And a number of the justices were very upset, because it was their view that Berger was doing this in order to spare Nixon the embarrassment of Roe versus Wade coming out the day before his inauguration, with several of the justices who he appointed joining the opinion. But the other consequence of that was much more painful for one of the law clerks. One of the clerks was very close with the reporter at Time magazine, and the reporter had been badgering him for a long time to let him know what in fact was going to happen in Roe. And the clerk finally said to him, look, I'll tell you, but you can't have it come out before the next week's edition of Time magazine. So on that Friday morning before the case was supposed to come out, the clerk told the reporter what the outcome was going to be, what the vote was going to be, what the reasoning was going to be, on the theory that that Time magazine would come out the following Monday afternoon after the court handed down its decision. And unbeknownst to the clerk, Berger Friday afternoon announced that he was going to file a concurring opinion, delaying the release of the case for a week. And so Time magazine had the story and published it about the outcome of the case a week before the decision came down. And this was very embarrassing to the court, and Berger was livid. And Berger demanded that every law clerk take a lie detector test. And I remember Brennan told us, don't worry, there were 3 clerks that year, don't worry boys, nobody questions my clerks but me, and I'm not questioning you. And he told Berger that he refused to allow his clerks to have a lie detector test, and most of the other justices said the same thing, and that eventually disappeared. But it was a very stressful moment in the court.
There's sort of also, you were talking a little bit about it the other night. The reaction to the case, of course, was extreme, and it did have an impact on one of the justices.
Right. Blackmun, who wrote Roe versus Wade, up until that time was still very much regarded as a conservative, predictably law and order, government side vote. And he and Berger were known as the Minnesota Twins because they almost always voted together in cases up until basically and a little after Roe versus Wade. And what explains Blackmun's vote in Roe, which is one of the great mysteries, is clearly the experience that he had with the Mayo Clinic. He was the general counsel for the Mayo Clinic before he became a judge, and that gave him a very special appreciation of the role of doctors. In fact, the original drafts of Roe versus Wade focused not on the woman's right, but on the doctor's right. And that was the other negotiation that developed within the court. So early on, Blackmun wanted to write the opinion in such a way so there was no such thing as a woman's right to privacy. This was basically about a doctor's right of autonomy to practice his profession, free from unwarranted interference. And again, Brennan played a role not only in the trimester approach, but also in moving Blackmun away from the doctor's right to the woman's right. But in any event, until that time, Blackmun was clearly regarded as a predictably, consistently conservative vote. The response to Roe was overwhelming in terms of the number of letters that the court received, particularly Justices Blackmun as the author of the opinion and Brennan as the court's only Catholic, that were opinions that were quite hostile to the decision and to those two justices. And whereas Brennan refused to read any of the letters on the ground that they were extrajudicial and not appropriate for his attention, Blackmun really insisted on reading them. He felt it was his responsibility to read them. And one evening, I was looking for one of Blackmun's clerks as we were working together on a case, and it must have been around midnight or so, and I walked into Blackmun's chambers, and the clerk wasn't there, but I saw Blackmun in his office with all the lights out except for a green desk lamp, and there was a stack of letters that had been laid out flat by his secretary, I assume, on his desk, taken out of the envelopes. And he was sitting there with his glasses down over his nose and reading them very thoughtfully. And it was clear that he was deeply pained by the strong emotional reactions of the individuals who'd written these letters, most of which were form letters. You know, every kid in a kindergarten class had been, "Why are you killing babies, Justice Blackmun?" Although some were more personal and more thoughtful. But I believe it was that experience and the experience of being ostracized and attacked after Roe versus Wade that first began the process of transformation by which Justice Blackmun shifted from being a predictable conservative vote to someone who demonstrated an increasing degree of compassion and concern for the rights of the individual as a justice, and eventually led to him becoming one of the more liberal justices on the court.
I'm a student in your class, and I want you to tell me about your boss, William Brennan. What would you say?
Brennan was a lovely person, one of the most likable, most winning people I've ever met, or anyone I know has ever met. He had a sort of Irish, elfin, leprechaun demeanor, buoyant, always cheerful, always touching. He always took your arm. He always had a kind word. Almost never did I see him depressed or unhappy or defeated. There were some moments during the year when I think he felt a little defeated, when cases that he had worked very hard to create 6-7 years earlier under the Warren Court were being emasculated by the justices of the Berger Court. But except for those moments, which were few and far between, he was just somebody who was always a breath of joy. Whenever he entered a room, you just had this sense of lights going on. So he was quite a unique person in that regard. He was quite passionate about the law. He believed deeply in his role and the role of the Supreme Court as there to make this a better society and to protect the rights of minorities and the disenfranchised and the disadvantaged, and that a fundamental reason for the court to exist was to represent the otherwise unrepresented, and that provisions of the Constitution, like the provisions guaranteeing due process and freedom of religion and equal protection, he felt really embodied the responsibility of the court. So he took that quite seriously, and his belief was that justices who turned their back on those values were really turning their back on both the Constitution and the Supreme Court. He was also someone who was extremely effective at finding ways to create majorities. He prided himself on being able to bring people around to his point of view, partly by persuasion, partly by finding common ground, partly by willing to compromise and not being begrudging about that. He was always willing, if necessary, to rewrite a paragraph to enable someone to join the opinion, and took as a great satisfaction in the ability to forge a majority whenever he could do that, and he was extremely effective at it.
Warren Berger.
Warren Berger was self-important and sometimes quite pompous. He could alienate the other judges by being heavy-handed, by exercising his authority in ways that they sometimes felt was clumsy and inappropriate. At a personal level, he seemed like a perfectly nice person, and he was capable of extraordinary grace. On one occasion, and this is so inconsistent with the image people have of Berger, the Supreme Court has a basketball court. And one of the things the clerks and occasionally one or two of the justices would do was to play basketball. Justice White used to play with us when I was a clerk, and he was a cheat, frankly. He would call fouls when there weren't fouls, and you could never call fouls on him. But one day we were playing basketball, and Lee Bollinger, who's now the president of Columbia University, who was a Berger clerk that year, turned his ankle. And we helped him hobble back down to the chambers, and it was February, it was very cold out, and we had to get him over to a hospital. And it must have been 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, and the chief came out of his chambers and he saw us, and he saw we were about to take Lee out wearing his basketball shorts, because we couldn't get his pants on over his leg, his foot, because it was twisted and it hurt too much. And Berger said, "You can't go out like that, it's too cold." And he went back and he brought us the Chief Justice's robes. And Lee went to the hospital wearing Berger's robes. And that was so out of character for the image of Berger. Not just being nice, but being nice in a way that was completely not tied up with the puffery of the position, that it was very endearing. So although the general impression one had of Berger was of someone who didn't know how to exercise his authority gracefully, there were certainly moments when he was capable of being quite genuine and quite human.
Byron White, other than calling cheap fouls.
Wright was very smart, very lawyer-like, very quiet. He was a silent person. Conversations with White often required you to make conversation, which was awkward for law clerks. He took the job very seriously. He had a strong view about equality and was often quite liberal when it came to issues of equal protection, but on most other constitutional issues and civil liberties issues, he was quite conservative. On criminal law issues, on free speech issues, he tended to be genuinely a conservative. A lot of people who had celebrated his appointment were disappointed that he was not more predictably on the left side of the court. He was a good technician, I think not a great justice. He tended to write opinions that were mechanical, and he certainly had no interest in eloquence. It wasn't part of his style. So I think White was a very capable justice who left a very modest legacy.
Thurgood Marshall.
Well, Marshall was a great man. I mean, his career is one of the great careers in American law. from the time he started work with the NAACP as a lawyer. On the Supreme Court, by the time I got to know Marshall, he was already in his 70s, and he was a jovial, funny, warm, anecdotal telling person. He loved to tell stories. He had wonderful stories. He was a great storyteller. He loved to tell stories on himself. He loved to tell stories on others. Oftentimes when I would spend time in his chambers with his law clerks, and the chambers of Brennan and Marshall were adjacent, and Brennan and Marshall were very close, so there was more interaction between our two chambers than we had with any others. But almost every time I was in the chambers with Marshall, he would insist on telling a story that almost always had some relevance to whatever it was that was going on. As a justice, like Brennan, he had a deep sense of the role of the court and the importance of the court in American society, was often very frustrated being in the minority in the Berger court. Probably not as much as Brennan, who had a long run before that with the Warren court when he was able to be in the majority. But there were many instances I know where Marshall was deeply frustrated by his colleagues taking positions that he thought were inconsistent with the responsibilities of the court. He was a very thoughtful person, particularly on issues relating to race. If you got Marshall talking about questions of race, you would come to have an understanding of what this country was like in the 30s, 40s, 50s that hard to find anywhere else.
Do you reflect on Brown, its legacy?
I don't actually recall a conversation with Marshall on Brown. Of course he did, but I just can't personally recall any conversation like that.
You got to tell the elevator story.
One day during that year, one of Marshall's clerks and I were in the Supreme Court elevator with Marshall, heading up to the library, and the elevator stopped on the ground floor, went down first, and went to the ground floor, and a couple of tourists got in, a family, a husband and wife, and 2 or 3 children, and they saw Marshall standing near the elevator, and he was large, African American, wearing a sweater, and they obviously assumed he was an elevator operator, and they said, 3, please. And the clerk and I looked at each other with horror, and Marshall just said, yassa. And he pushed the button, and we went up to the 3rd floor, and they got out, and they had no idea that they'd ridden up the elevator with Justice Thurgood Marshall.
That's a great story. Rehnquist, he was a 2nd-year guy then.
Yeah, Rehnquist was the junior justice on the court. He was regarded as very smart, very conservative. He was a friendly person. The clerks typically had lunch once each year with each of the justices, and I recall the lunch with Rehnquist being one of great informality, and he was very open and willing to engage in all sorts of give and take. He was only in his 40s at that time and was clearly still learning the ropes. I think he looked at the other justices with a combination of respect and sometimes maybe a little disdain. But he was a consistently conservative vote that year. I don't remember the statistics, but my impression is that he virtually never voted other than the sort of straight conservative line, even more so than Berger and Blackmun. So on Roe, for example, he was one of the 2 dissenters with Justice White. So Rehnquist, in a way, was, I think, too predictable for his own good in the early years. The cases that were still coming to the court were not the ones that would later come to the court, which were focused more on the divisions that existed within the court a decade later, which would be more likely to lead Rehnquist to be on one side or the other. But in the early 70s, the court was still, for the most part, taking cases where Rehnquist could always vote the most conservative position on the court. He was sort of that court's Clarence Thomas or Scalia. At the personal level, he was very smart. There was no question. He was fun to talk to. He knew the law. He was interested in the law, and was interested clearly in learning how to do the job.
The other end of the spectrum, at the end of his career, was William Douglas.
Douglas was an irascible character. He had a reputation for routinely firing his clerks during the course of the year, and that indeed happened that year. He had 2 clerks, both women. They were the only women clerks that year, and I think on the same day, if my memory serves, he told them both they were fired because they hadn't done something that he unreasonably had wanted, and they were both very upset, and the secretary said to them, just come back tomorrow, pretend nothing happened, he'll make no mention of it. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Douglas was the only justice who did not meet with the clerks as a group, and my own dealings with him, which were few and far between, I think he clearly enjoyed the reputation he had had by that point of being an ill-tempered person. And so there was nothing nice about Bill Douglas in terms of the personal dealings with him from the standpoint of the law clerks at that time. He was, I think at his prime, he was quite brilliant. And even at this time in his career, he was able to dash off opinions on the bench. I mean, he would hear an argument in case A, and while case B was being argued, he would be writing the opinion in case A. They were not very good opinions. He was eloquent. He did have a wonderful turn of phrase, but I think he lost interest in the technical responsibilities of a justice, of being careful with precedent and doctrine long ago. And therefore, his opinions that year, I think, tended, with few exceptions, to be not models of first-rate Supreme Court opinions.
Potter Stuart.
Stuart smoked too much, which is what killed him. I certainly recall that he was never without a cigarette. He even used to sneak off the bench during oral arguments to have a cigarette. And he was also very smart, interesting man, seemed to me somewhat reserved. His primary interest as a justice was the First Amendment. He'd been an editor of the Yale newspaper, and that clearly had an impact on him. And Stuart's legacy is largely in decisions involving the freedom of the press and the First Amendment, where he took a very strong position consistently in defense of the press. Other than that, for the most part, he and Wright were kind of regarded as similar in the middle of the court. The way that court was sort of constituted, you had Douglas, Brennan, and Marshall as pretty predictable liberal votes, and then generally Berger, Blackmun, Rehnquist, and Powell as pretty conservative votes, and Wright and Stuart were basically in the middle. And sometimes they voted together, but oftentimes the liberal side of the court had the misfortune that you would get one but not the other. You usually get Wright on equal protection cases, but not Stuart, and Stuart on First Amendment cases, but not Wright, which meant you'd lost 5-4 a lot. But Stuart and Wright really were the two judges who were sort of the Kennedy, Souter, O'Connor of the current court. They were the swing votes, and without them you couldn't win because the other 7 would be pretty predictable in most cases.
You mentioned Lewis Powell.
I liked Powell quite a bit. Powell was a extremely decent person, very congenial, liked the law clerks, liked being a judge, thought really hard about it. He also was new at the job, and like Rehnquist, had not had a judicial position before, so he was coming to all of this fresh. Did not have a sense of a deep confidence that he knew how to do the job, and therefore he really liked talking with his clerks and with other other judges about how to do the job. He was pretty open-minded. There were some interesting stories about Powell at this time. In this term, the Supreme Court, in addition to Roe versus Wade, also decided the most important obscenity cases of the last 35 years, Miller versus California and Paris Adult Theater. And these 2 cases redefined the law of obscenity in a way that remains the case to this day. And going into the decision of the case, there were 8 votes that were pretty clear. Rehnquist, Berger, Wright, and Blackmun were clearly going to reaffirm the position that obscenity was not protected by the First Amendment, and even adopt a broader definition of what could be deemed obscene. And Douglas, Stuart, Marshall, and Brennan had reached the view that at least for consenting adults, that the state could not prohibit something called obscenity. And Brennan, who was very eager to win the case, had placed his hopes on Justice Powell and had worked on Powell, talked to him a lot about the issue of obscenity for several weeks before the case was argued, and really felt that he had Powell on his side, and Powell in fact had said that Brennan could count on his vote. But in those days they had to watch all of the movies that were at issue in the specific cases. And they went into the Supreme Court movie theater, and Powell, a Southern gentleman whose idea of obscenity was kind of Lady Chatterley's lover, and who goes into this theater and sees what was really obscenity at the time. And it was very graphic, very explicit, probably truly without redeeming value. And he came out and he just said to Brennan, "You lost." And Brennan, I remember, was very disheartened by that. And yeah, that was an instance of a justice who had the rude awakening of seeing the real world in a way that in the more sheltered existence he'd led up to that point hadn't seen it. And that's one of the things that I think does cause justices to change their views over time, is that they are exposed in a variety of ways to worlds that previously they've often been sheltered from. And it's why the notion of judges over time becoming more liberal, I think it probably is both descriptively accurate and is explainable by the fact that as they see through certiorari petitions, thousands of them a year, what happens to individuals who are arrested and accused of crime, and the abuses that sometimes happen in the name of government authority, I think they get a very different perspective on how the world works, and that tends to affect their sense of the responsibilities of the court.
Was the Flood case there during your term, Flood?
No, Flood was earlier,
okay.
Right.
Aside from Bill Brennan, who is your Supreme Court hero?
Oh, I would say that Holmes, Brandeis, and Jackson were the three who I most admired. Holmes, because of his opinions in the Abrams case and Gitlow, which really gave birth to the American tradition of free speech. Holmes was sometimes a great justice, sometimes not a great justice, but he rose to the occasion after a very limping start in these First Amendment cases, and really has profoundly changed the nation in those opinions, in the way in which he articulated the importance of free speech. And Brandeis, really for similar reasons. I mean, his concurring opinion in Whitney versus California is also, I think, one of the truly landmark opinions in the history of American law, and reinforced what Holmes had done in the First Amendment area. And Jackson, I think, primarily for me, for his opinion in West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett. Jackson was a great justice generally and a wonderful writer, but Barnett was a truly remarkable decision. At the height of World War II, for the Supreme Court to hold that it violated the First Amendment of the Constitution for the government to require school children to pledge allegiance to the flag was an extraordinary testament to the willingness of the court to place individual freedom over a kind of regimented patriotism. And Jackson's opinion in the case is truly one of the most memorable and most eloquent that any justice has ever written. And of course, his opinion in Korematsu was a great opinion, as was his opinion in the Steel Seizure case. And Jackson had, throughout his career, a kind of integrity and character to the process. You always had the sense with Jackson that what you were getting was a mind at work. That when you read his opinions, this was not written by a law clerk. This was written by a person who was truly engaged in the problem presented. And the opinion was not simply an excuse for a result reached on other grounds. He really let you into his head. And you felt that when you read a Jackson opinion, you understood why he felt the way he did. And that's not true for very many Supreme Court opinions. The vast majority of those opinions more recently are written by law clerks, and they have a bureaucratic feel to them, and they often have nothing to do with the real reasoning of the justice. or even when they're written by the justice, they often tend to be good briefs for their position, rather than a candid explication of what their thought process is. And in Jackson's opinions, you really feel that you are talking to somebody, and that's a great gift, both to be able to do that, but also it's a great gift for people who read it, because it gives you an insight into how somebody genuinely thinks through the problems and how they grapple with them.
When you were at University of Chicago Law School, did Jackson mean much during that constitutional law process? Was he brought up much?
You mean when I was a student?
Yeah. What did, well, let's do this. When you came to the court as a clerk for Brennan, did Jackson have a jurisprudence which sort of you could identify and touch?
Not as clearly as, say, a Douglas or a Frankfurter or a Black, because Jackson was more pragmatic as a justice. He did not, for the most part, speak in sweeping generalities. He was more interested in the details of individual cases. So where you could identify clear judicial philosophies to some justices, like Douglas, Black, Frankfurter, I think it was less clear with Jackson that you could pigeonhole him in that way. He was more of a judge's judge, in the sense of, you had the sense that each case engaged him, and he thought hard about the merits of each case. And the virtue of that is that he's behaving in the way that the sort of idealized judge behaves. The disadvantage is you're less likely to leave a sort of simple catchphrase legacy of, the First Amendment's an absolute. Jackson didn't really have absolutes in that way.
You wrote this magnificent book, Perilous Times, and you found sort of a triumvirate of people in Biddle, Murphy, and Jackson. Sort of, you seem to weave those three through. Why those three?
Well, I, as I was writing the book, I sort of discovered this. Discovered it for myself, not for others. And I found it quite a remarkable contrast to other administrations. Here you had three individuals, each of whom, in his own way and for his own reasons and from his own history, was clearly determined not to make the mistakes of the past. They knew what had happened in World War I. They had experienced the excesses of that period. They deplored those excesses at the time and were very conscious about wanting to help the nation through a period of crisis without repeating the same mistakes. And each of them talked about this in a variety of settings before having authority, and each of them struggled with it once they had this authority. And I found them as a threesome just quite commendable in what they tried to bring to the positions of Solicitor General, Attorney General, Supreme Court Justice, Jackson being the only one of the three to hold all three positions, of both balancing their obligations to the Commander-in-Chief and to the President who'd appointed them, on the one hand, with having their independent sense of what the Constitution and what the values of the nation require. And I thought each of them handled these responsibilities well. And as a result of each of them, the nation did better in World War II than it would otherwise have done. The one great civil liberties tragedy of that era, of course, was the internment of the Japanese. And it's interesting that Biddle, as Attorney General, argued vehemently against it and tried desperately to persuade Roosevelt not to do this. And both Murphy and Jackson voted against the constitutionality of the internment in the Korematsu case. So they really demonstrated what the book was designed to demonstrate, which is that one can learn from the history. One can see our own mistakes and take measures to avoid repeating them if one's really thoughtful about it. So they were, in an important way, heroes of the story that I tell in the book, because they really exemplified what I think American citizens have to learn how to do.
What's next for Jeff Stone?
I have several projects that I am already at work on. One is a series of volumes with the Oxford University Press on rights, and this will be a series of about 15 to 20 volumes of which I'm the general editor. I'm not going to write 15 to 20 volumes, although I'll write the final volume. And what led me to conceive this was that recognition from the successive perilous times that it is possible to educate a more general universe of readers about the importance of the law and constitutional law and civil liberties. And so the idea of this series is to bring distinguished thinkers, lawyers, historians, political scientists, and invite them to write short volumes, 40 to 50,000 words, about each of the central rights that we value, and also some of them will be about themes that cut across individual rights, and to write provocative essays. They're not meant to be simple, straightforward, everything you wanted to know about free speech, and they're not by any means meant to be celebrations of any particular point of view. They're written by people, they will be written by people across the political and ideological spectrum. But the idea is to be provocative, interesting, and to engage people in thinking about what it means to have freedom of religion, what it means to have freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, or why we care about equality, how we think about the enforcement of constitutional rights, what the role of courts are in this regard. And as I say, the authors are people who will range from Larry Tribe and Alan Dershowitz on the left to people like Dick Posner and Mike McConnell on the right. And so the idea is to present a broad spectrum of positions. And at least tentatively, my final volume in the series is based on the premise that President Bush will have enough nominees to transform the court in a way that will justify the final volume being called The End of Rights. But we'll wait and see whether that happens. A second project I'm working on is a book for Norton, who published the Perilous Times book, for which I have a title but not a word written, of Sexing the Constitution. And what I'm interested in there is essentially how we came to start with the Constitution, which no one at the time presumably thought had anything to do with issues of sexuality, of homosexuality, abortion, obscenity, contraception, sterilization, to one which is very much interested in those issues. And I'm particularly curious about what people in the 17th and 18th century thought about those questions, how the law operated at that time, why they didn't think of these as potentially constitutional rights, and then to see where we began to change in our thinking about those issues. When in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries are the first glimmers of the law moving in these directions, and then culminating with a quick survey of the much more familiar period in the Supreme Court since 1965. And the third project I'm working on actually is the American Constitution the American Constitution Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Press will publish a book by me on civil liberties in wartime, which will be largely in a very abridged version of Perilous Times. And they want to reach a much broader audience, and I think that's a good thing to do, so I will largely make this book, cut it by about 80%, and then do some transition and try to make a much more available book for the general reader who wants to know something about our history in wartime.
Did you find when you finally saw this in print and then you did maybe a little more research that you'd say, I wish I had done a little bit more here?
Sure, you're always learning. And first of all, people bring to your attention things you didn't know, and you always have insights. I mean, you never stop learning. One of the great things about being an academic is that if you have a wise career, you don't jump from one thing to another feeling that you've completed each one each time, but you come back to the same questions 5, 10, 20 years later, and you've gained new insight, new perspective on it, and you can go back to those questions with a much greater sense of sophistication. So yeah, I've thought of many things since I've written this that I wish I could write over again, and maybe at some point I'll do another edition. I actually had a chance to do that for the paperback. The publisher wanted me to redo the final short section on the war on terrorism. And I actually said I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to make this a book about the war on terrorism. It was really meant to be a book that would have more lasting value. And I didn't want to sort of update every 6 months what had most recently happened. But I could imagine at some point, 10, 15 years from now, maybe 10, 15 years from now, I'm still around, doing another edition that would give me a chance to put into the book some of the things I will have learned afterwards.
What question should I have asked you that I haven't asked you?
It's a question I'd love to ask in interviews. You're a great interviewer. I suppose you could ask, although we've asked it on other occasions, about the current Supreme Court, and what, maybe not so much speculating on who the justice or justices will be, but what effect it'll have. And I think the effect, we're now at a moment, we're doing this at a moment when O'Connor has retired. There's a strong belief that Rehnquist will retire at some point in the next year or two at the outside, that Justice Stevens may retire over the next several years just as a matter of age. And I think this will have a transformative effect on the court, probably even greater than the Berger court, replacing the Warren court. But at the same time, I don't want to make the mistake that people made at the time that the Berger court came into existence, which is to underestimate the extent to which constancy and stability are values that lawyers hold dear, and that they aren't so quick to jettison everything that went before, even if they disagree strongly with everything that went before. So I suspect what will happen over the next 5 years is significant changes in the law with respect to areas like abortion, affirmative action, campaign finance reform, church and state. In all those issues, I think we will see a significant move towards the Scalia-Thomas view and away from, say, the Stevens-Ginsburg view. But I don't think we'll see it as a black and white matter. I don't think we'll see Roe overruled instantly or the affirmative action decision overruled instantly. I think for the most part, justices know that their coin depends on respect for that institution. And respect for that institution, for the most part, requires that it be seen as not a political entity, that it be seen as a legal entity. And that's what I think explains people like O'Connor and Kennedy and Souter not overruling Roe versus Wade, a decision they would, at least by the time they had occasion to evaluate it, they would never have agreed with it. Yet they understood that for the court to overrule it would demean the court itself as an institution. And I do think that justices have great respect for the institution of the court. So I think we will see strong moves away from the current state of the law on issues like that, but I think they will be incremental, not dramatic overrulings.
John's got some questions.
You've had wonderful experiences and insights into a lot of people. I've just got a few more. Judge Wright, can you tell us about him?
Sure. Scalia Wright, I was law clerk for in 1971-72. He was a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Very liberal, very activist judge, highly respected and beloved in progressive circles and anathema in conservative circles. Wright was a wonderful man, painfully shy, which surprised me. Not at all eloquent or articulate. He had a very hard time in conversation. He'd had a remarkable career. He grew up in New Orleans and was part of the Democratic Party in New Orleans and became a U.S. attorney and then federal district judge and began making his national reputation when he insisted on enforcing Brown versus Board of Education in school desegregation cases in New Orleans, which made him extremely unpopular. His house was firebombed on several occasions. He had to send his wife and son to live somewhere else for a year or two during that period. when John Kennedy appointed him to the United States Court of Appeals, it was clearly driven by the desire of Southern senators to get him out of Louisiana. Not to promote him, but just to get him out of Louisiana, because they didn't want such a liberal judge down there. And when he moved to the Court of Appeals, Judge Wright continued to have this real passion for justice. Like Brennan, he clearly had a sense that the role of the court was to protect people who needed the court's protection, and that the reason for giving judges life tenure was to free them from the abuse of the majoritarian and the democratic processes, and that those people who would systematically be oppressed in a majoritarian system were precisely those who were the constituents of the court. And Wright believed that, if anything, even more passionately than Brennan. And it's certainly true that you could say Judge Wright was, in approaching cases, result-oriented, in the sense that if he could decide a case in a way that would make the law better, in his view, from the perspective of protecting the disadvantaged, that was his goal. And if he couldn't do that, he wouldn't. He would respect the boundaries and the constraints of precedent. But it was clear very quickly, as his law clerk, that he wasn't interested in a careful analysis of what the law suggested. His approach to not all cases, certainly, many of them didn't involve issues that involved these sorts of questions. But when it did, it was clear that Wright's basic view was, can we reach this result in a way that is consistent and respectable with respect to the law? And I came greatly to admire his passion in that regard. One of the things I found was that in law school, professors had, for the most part, rightly, so drained law from its values and so taught the intellectual process, the rigorous analytical process of tearing apart an argument and seeing all sides of it and being able to put it back together again without regard to whose ox was being gored, in a sort of highly clinical sense, which was a critical skill for any good lawyer or judge to have, but that it became easy to forget that the law really is about something other than this kind of abstracted intellectual exercise, and that it really is about affecting people's lives, and that affecting people's lives is one of the things that judges should take into account as they decide cases. They need to be able to reason about the legal principles and the doctrines and the precedents, but it should not be a matter of indifference to them what impact a decision has upon society. And spending time with Wright really reawakened for me the fact that that was in fact a critical part of what law is about. Having said that, I mean, interestingly, I still find myself as a teacher, for the most part, doing what I think law school most needs to do for their students, which is to give them the intellectual skills that they need. Because if they allow their values to get in the way, they never actually learn the skills. They think they can solve the case by saying, I know what the right answer is. So I find myself kind of doing the same things my teachers did, and feeling, for the most part, comfortable with it, but also recognizing that there's a risk of misleading them in terms of the role of value. So I sort of, at the end of the course, I'll sort of say, by the way, don't forget that, you know, this is not only about thinking, it's also about feeling and about understanding what's right and wrong. But it is interesting how there is this process in law school that when it's done right, really drains from students an understanding of the fact that values do matter, and appropriately matter.
This may connect. Another senior to you figure I wanted to ask about was Edward Levy.
Mm-hmm. Edward was Edward was a University of Chicago person. He went to the University of Chicago laboratory schools from nursery school through 12th grade. He went to the College of the University of Chicago, went to the Law School of the University of Chicago, joined the faculty of the law school, became dean, provost, president of the university, and then eventually Attorney General of the United States, and then came back and joined the faculty after he was Attorney General. So Edward is the quintessential University of Chicago person, and probably the person who is the most important alumnus of the University of Chicago of the second half of the university's existence, and most important figure of the second half of the university's existence. Edward was a truly great man, and a great teacher, and a fascinating person. So far as I could tell in my dealings with Edward, he kind of lived the Socratic method. When I was invited to be dean of the law school in 1987, Edward was back, having served as Attorney General, and I decided before accepting, which I had already decided I would do, that I should ask a few people's advice as a courtesy. And Edward was the first one that occurred to me, and so I asked Edward if he'd had lunch with me. And we sat down, and I said, I'd like to know what you think about whether I should accept President Kray's invitation to become dean of the law school. And for the next hour, Edward played law professor. So when I asked that question, he said, well, what do you think about that? And I told him what I thought about that, and then he said, well, you know, have you given any thought to this? And I realized about halfway through the lunch that he would not make a declarative statement. That in no way was he going to give me advice, or at least was he going to give me advice easily. It would all have to come indirectly. And finally, at the very end of the lunch, he offered his only declarative statement, which I've never forgotten and which I thought was quite brilliant, and it's been a guide for me, and I've passed it on to many people ever since. I said to him, at this point, giving up on ever getting anything but a question and response, but I said to him, what makes a great dean? And he said, a dean should radiate the values of the institution. And that was really priceless, because it captured so perfectly what is a fundamental bit of wisdom for anyone who's leading an institution. And that was Edward. I mean, Edward was that. Edward was the University of Chicago. He was absolutely rigorous in his thinking. He believed that argument was the best form of discourse. It was impossible to imagine Edward resenting any criticism of his work or of his decision-making, as long as it was made in good faith. Getting to the right answer was at the core of what he was like as a person. And he was just a great role model for anybody who had the opportunity to be around him.
Another Chicago person, although I'm not clear on how his chronology intersected with yours, Antonin Scalia.
Scalia and I were colleagues for about 6-7 years, I suppose. He joined the faculty after having served in the government for several years. He'd been on the faculty at Virginia before that. He was not actually an easy appointment for the faculty. When he first came under consideration, many people felt he was too much of a government lawyer and not enough of an academic, and that it wasn't clear that he was really dedicated to being a scholar and being an academic, and he was much more interested in going back ultimately to Washington or to be on the bench, and that his coming to Chicago was not a real commitment to the profession. David Kray, who is also a colleague at Chicago, who had been in law school with Scalia, and who rarely took strong positions on faculty appointments, circulated a memo to the faculty saying that he had known Scalia at Harvard and had kept in touch with him since, and that we would be making a terrible mistake if we did not appoint him, that he was a person of great intellect and great intellectual integrity. And it was really David's support that carried the day. I don't know if Nino even knows this story, but it was David's support that carried the day. Without that, I think the appointment wouldn't have been made. So Scalia then joined the faculty, and he and I knew each other quite well. We both taught constitutional law, although from very different perspectives. And we talked all the time about that. We disagreed about most things. He played poker in the faculty poker game, and so socially we got to know him very well as well. And one of our daughters was a classmate of one of his many children. It's pretty hard to have a child who wasn't a classmate of one of the Scalia children. Mathematically, it was almost impossible. And so Scalia was a lively, engaging, challenging intellect, a person who was filled with ideas, somewhat, in my view, sometimes too confident about the rightness of his ideas, not always as open to legitimate rethinking of questions as I would have liked, although he may have said the same thing about me. As a teacher, I think he was regarded as less effective than the students would have liked and that he would have liked. And Scalia actually said something to me fairly recently that I thought was very revealing and touching. We were at a lunch back at the University of Chicago with several faculty members about a year or two ago, and someone asked him about his experience when he'd been on the faculty. And he said his one regret was that he really hadn't taken teaching sufficiently seriously, that he hadn't appreciated how much of an impact the teachers have on their students and how much they can guide and shape the way they think about the law. And he wished he had done that more seriously when he was a professor. So that was interesting to me because it suggested that Scalia realized that he was not, in fact, as successful a teacher as he could have been. And I think part of it was an undue self-righteousness about his positions that conveyed themselves to the students sometimes in ways that I think were silencing to the students. And also I think he probably didn't prepare as much as he perhaps should have prepared. But as a colleague, he was wonderful. I mean, he was always fun. He had a great sense of humor. And you could never be with Scalia without sparks flying. A very interesting person.
How do you think 18 years on the court have worn on him, knowing him and observing him personally